to provide the freedoms necessary for the gospel to be restored and the restored gospel of Jesus Christ to succeed and flourish. And we're the beneficiaries of that. We're the recipients of this preparation, and we're also the beneficiaries and recipients of those who have paid a dear price so that we could enjoy the freedoms that we do.
There can be no question that Joseph Smith's family was being prepared for a prophet of God. We know that Joseph Smith had several ancestors that came aboard the Mayflower. They were prominent key figures in the Plymouth colony. We also know that they fought in the Revolutionary Wars. They were patriots, but they were also searchers. One of them was named Aziel Smith. Aziel Smith was privileged to receive a revelation that told him that someone in his posterity line would be born who would literally change religious thinking.
The Smith ancestor of Joseph Smith was Robert Smith, who came to New England and landed at Boston in 1638. He ended up in Topsfield, north of Boston, and the family lived there about 200 years. Joseph Smith's grandfather was Aziel Smith, and Aziel was a very interesting individual raised in the congregational tradition. Nevertheless, he was a very independent thinker. He was a universalist, which meant that he believed that God would save all people ultimately. And Joseph Smith Sr. followed his tracks in this universalism. And so Joseph Smith inherited a tradition of independence, a tradition of expectation, a tradition that was broader than the traditional New England religion, believing that God would reach out to all people.
When considering the influence of Joseph Smith's heritage, one must also consider his maternal ancestors, the Mack family. Ebenezer Mack immigrated from Scotland in 1669 to the New England area looking for both spiritual guidance as well as an economic fortune. Unfortunately, it didn't turn out that way for Ebenezer, and he lost most of his financial goods. As a result, his son Solomon, which was Joseph Smith's grandfather, was bound out as a youth, and as such was influenced in seeking for some form of riches throughout his life. Unfortunately, this didn't pan out. But Solomon continued to look for some type of stability, both financially and spiritually, and ended up in New Hampshire, there seeking to be able to establish his family and some type of foundation. This greatly influenced Joseph Smith and his heritage as they sought for spiritual stability as well as some type of financial stability.
Joseph Smith Sr. and Lucy Mack Smith met in the general store there in Tunbridge, Vermont, that was owned by Stephen Mack, Lucy Mack's brother. After they met, they fell in love and eventually married. They settled down in a place called Tunbridge, Vermont, where Joseph Smith Sr. was a farmer. Eventually, an entrepreneurial type of business will take these Smiths now from the area. They will settle for a time in a place called Royalton and also Randolph, before finally settling on the rented farm owned by Solomon Mack in a place called Sharon, Windsor County, Vermont. By the time they reached that area, they had 3 children, Alvin, Hiram, and Sophronia. It will be on a wintry day in Sharon, Vermont, when Joseph Smith Jr. was born to Joseph Smith Sr. and Lucy Mack on December 23, 1805.
At one point in Lucy's life, she became ill with tuberculosis herself and had a Methodist minister come and visit with her and encourage her to get religion, to be saved. And she became deeply worried about her soul. And at that point, she made a covenant with God, a promise that if he would help her to be made well, she would spend her days serving him and searching for the right way. And she was true to that promise, although she could never find what she was satisfied with spiritually. It's no wonder that her son Joseph inherits the same kind of longing for salvation, but also unsatisfaction with the various possibilities of worship in his day.
Lucy Mack Smith, the mother of the prophet, left a tremendous historical record of her family. She gives 7 dreams of her husband in New England and in New York over an 8-year period, just prior to the time that Joseph Smith began receiving his visions. The prophet's father is actually seeking a box in one dream, and in the other dream, the fruit of a tree, much like Lehi's dream in the Book of Mormon. And this shows the common denominator of all of these dreams, that he was seeking God's will, seeking God's path, and seeking God's favor.
In 1811, the Smith family moves to Lebanon, New Hampshire, and in late 1812, there's an outbreak of typhoid fever that covers the entire upper Connecticut River Valley there. 6,000 people die. It's a tremendous suffering that occurs, and the Smith family doesn't escape that either. One by one, the children come down with the typhoid fever, and Joseph's sister Sophronia, who's just older than he, is ill and nearly dies, has it for 3 months. Joseph also gets the fever and appears to be recovering, but then the fever moves into his arm and leg and develops a serious case of osteomyelitis, and he'll go through 4 major operations before this is resolved.
And all of these operations took place without anesthetic upon a young boy who really, in a way, took charge of what was happening. The doctors came to examine his leg several times, and they opened up the left shin bone, the tibia actually, and they scraped. The dying of the bone tissue had gone so far that they even considered amputating. And of course the mother and Joseph said they would not undertake that at all.
15 miles away is Dartmouth Medical School. Nathan Smith was the chief surgeon and professor, and they started the medical school there at Dartmouth. And he was called upon and came down to give some assistance. Nathan Smith is unique. He's very unusual because he is doing some experimentation in a day when surgery isn't well known. But he went right down and with his tools went to work. They drilled the long bone, and they broke off the diseased portion, this bacterial infection. There was a lot of bleeding and a lot of screaming. Lucy, who had gone out somewhere, some distance from the house, when they started breaking things off, she came in to answer the screams and saw this unusual scene of blood shed.
Over time, it turned out the operation, of course, was successful, and Joseph kept his leg. The healing was long-term. Joseph would go to Salem, sent there to be with his Uncle Jesse Smith there, where they felt that the cool breezes of the ocean would help him in healing. He'd be on crutches for nearly 4 years until this had finally healed. It's remarkable as we think about this whole experience that the very doctor, the only doctor apparently at that time, who had begun any experimentary techniques with this advanced stages of osteomyelitis, would be within 5 miles of Joseph Smith's home. It's also significant to consider that Joseph Smith, little would he understand at this time just how necessary it would be for him to have this leg. He's going to make several round trips between Kirtland and Missouri and other locations. And so we can see the hand of the Lord here, preparing and watching over this young man who was to become a prophet in preserving his leg in this rather marvelous manner.
With devastating medical bills and struggling to eke out a living as farmers on the Connecticut River, the Smith family thought to better themselves by moving to Norwich, Vermont. There they again attempted to make a living by farming, but in the years 1814, 15, and 16, they faced crop failure, a situation all too familiar to New England farmers.
The worst of those years was 1816, because during that summer from June 8th